Καλησπέρα. Καλώς ήρθατε στην Βρετανική Σχολή. Λέγομαι John Bennett και είμαι ο διευθυντής της σχολής. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the British School. My name is John Bennett. I'm the director. It's a great pleasure to see a good number of people here for the second of our Upper House seminars of 2017. The Fitch Laboratory at the BSA has many research collaborations both within Greece and beyond, and these involve the techniques that the laboratory has pioneered here in Greece and continues to develop, but are not confined, of course, to material which is excavated or otherwise collected in Greece. One recent collaboration involved a combined petrographic and chemical study of ceramics from the Konya Plain survey, which was carried out by John Gate, who's the Williams Fellow in Ceramic Petrology, and Dr. Noemi Müller, who's our Scientific Research Officer. The collaboration was funded by the British Academy, and the survey itself was carried out under the auspices of our sister institution, the British Institute at Ankara. And the director of that survey project is Douglas Baird, Professor of Near Eastern Archaeology in the Department of Archaeology Classics and Egyptology at the University of Liverpool, whom it's a great pleasure to welcome to the BSA. Douglas is here to discuss continuing collaboration with the Fitch, but we're very pleased that while he's here, he's agreed not only to deliver this evening's seminar, but also to give a seminar in the Fitch Wiener series, which, if you haven't heard already, will take place on Wednesday afternoon, but at 5 p.m., not at 7 p.m., the normal Fitch Wiener time. Douglas completed his PhD at the University of Edinburgh on the Neolithic of the desert zones of the Levant. Between 1982 and 1987, he carried out excavations, field survey and research on chipped stone and ceramics in the Middle East, in Jordan, in Iraq, those were the days, and in Cyprus. His main research interests are in the development and nature of the world's earliest sedentary farming and pastoral communities, which appeared in the Near East between about 20,000 and 6,000 BC, and also the development of the earliest complex urban and state societies, which appeared in the same region between 8,000 and 2,000 BC. And to address these goals, he's developed large-scale multi-investigator field projects focused on specific issues such as the emergence and character of these societies. His research has also involved the study of ancient ceramics and chipped stone to gain insights into human behaviour. He's directed three major archaeological field projects: the Tel Esh-Shunna project in Jordan, dealing with the Chalcolithic and early Bronze Age of the southern Levant; the Konya Plain survey, to which I referred earlier, in Turkey, dealing with the long-term settlement history of central Anatolia between 10,000 BC and 1750 AD; and thirdly, the Binarbaşı and Bonjuklu projects in Turkey, which approach the appearance of the first sedentary and agricultural societies. And his lecture this evening here relates to the latter project, with the title The Development and Spread of the Neolithic in Anatolia and the Antecedents of Çatalhöyük, the Evidence from Bonjuklu. So I'll ask Douglas. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Thanks for having me here. It's really nice to come and talk in Athens and see Athens after rather a long time. I think it was last here in 1983. You probably weren't born then, so we won't dwell on that too long. I'll change the title slightly, but it's essentially the same set of topics that I want to cover. By the way, can you hear me at the back, even if I'm not speaking into the microphones? Yes? Okay, because I don't like standing immediately behind the microphone, so I like walking around a little bit. So as long as you can hear me, that's fine. Ooh, okay, just in case. Thanks. So I thought in order for you to get value for your money, and my money as it were, I'd actually try and cover two aspects of the Bonjuklu project, summed up by the slightly longer version of the title that I first gave and this version as well. Namely, the spread of farming in central and into western Anatolia, and I thought, given I presume most of you have largely Aegean interests, I thought that might interest you as I look west from central Anatolia, but also I wanted to talk a little bit about the nature of Neolithic households and the development of Neolithic households. It's a topic that's been much discussed recently, and I think we've got interesting evidence from Bonjuklu, and that's really where the antecedents of Çatalhöyük and skulls and animate houses come in. And so it's really a lecture of two halves that don't precisely connect up, although they are interrelated in significant ways. So bear with me on that. I hope you'll see, as the story unfolds, the interest in these particular aspects of the project. Before I proceed, I will point out that, like all these sorts of projects, as John mentioned, multi-investigator, there are many culprits responsible for the information that I'm going to give you. I'll certainly name and shame some of them as we go through the lecture, but I won't probably be able to mention absolutely everyone. Also, I will be covering quite a lot of information quite quickly in order to deal with these topics in as rounded a way as possible. And if you want more detail about some of the methods and some of the results that I'll only be able to touch on likely, then obviously I'm very happy to talk about it later on. But the first thing I should say is that the project is a collaboration, not just in the sense of being a multi-investigator activity, but also between three universities and several institutions. The British Institute at Ankara, of course, has to be mentioned as our primary sponsor. But in particular, the University of Liverpool, Zonguldak University, Bülent University, and the University of Queensland are the main institutional members of the project. So let's proceed to look at some of the detail of what I want to talk about. When we first started the project, and it remains the case, the overall aims were to look at the origins of agriculture and sedentism in central Anatolia, and also perhaps interconnected symbolic developments connected with what's being called the Neolithic Revolution, if you like. As the project developed, I think we understood more and more that really what we were documenting is the first step in the westward spread of farming from the Fertile Crescent through Anatolia, whether south or north or centre, and into Europe. So really what we're able to reflect on most the aspects of the spread of farming in terms of broader scale developments. And as I'm sure you'll appreciate, there's been much debate about the mechanisms for the spread of farming, whether we're looking at colonising farmers moving with a Neolithic package or adoption by indigenous foragers. These are worldwide debates relating to the spread of farming, and typically they're very polarised. People swing from one polar position to the other, occasionally stopping in the middle for a little reflection. But really, in that obsession with mechanisms, which is an important first step, of course, there's very little consideration of the significance for people caught up in this process of these developments. We, in particular, wanted to look a little bit more beyond the mechanisms and think about the significance for foragers and early farmers caught in this process of the transfer of farming, and in some cases for the rejection of farming by foraging communities. And in that understanding, I think, one of the outcomes of our project is a clear appreciation that we shouldn't understand these as homogeneous processes, even in any given area that we're looking at. So I'll explore this a little bit in the first half of the lecture in particular. The area that I'm going to talk about is the Konya Plain in south-central Anatolia, 1,000 metres above sea level, just north of the Taurus Mountains here. This is an area of marl plain where alluvial fans are deposited by rivers, inland drainage systems coming down from the Taurus Mountains to the south in particular. The famous site of Çatalhöyük, of course, World Heritage Site now, is slap bang in the middle of the Çarşamba alluvial flan in the southwest part of the Konya Plain. Bonjuklu, the main site that I'm talking about, is 10 kilometres north of Çatalhöyük on the same alluvial fan. 10,000 years ago, when the site was occupied, there wasn't an alluvial fan here, however, or even a big river, but rather we're looking at a wetland steppe mosaic, all of our paleoenvironmental indicators suggest. But we also excavated, as John said a bit earlier, at this site of Pınarbaşı on the western edge of the Karadağ, famous for Bimber Polisi, of course, researched by Ramsey and Bell in the early part of the 20th century, which is partly contemporary with Bonjuklu. So we're looking at two contemporary sites about 30 kilometres apart. In terms of the bigger picture of the spread of farming then, what's the situation in Anatolia? Well, really, very little in central and western Anatolia was known until about 15, 20 years ago. Indeed, when we started working on the Konya Plain, nothing was known predating Çatalhöyük in the plain itself, and only a little bit about Cappadocia from excavations at Bonjuklu. We've obviously found sites earlier than Çatal to look at the origins of farming in the Konya Plain, and since we started, more is now known of the West Anatolian Neolithic, especially from 3 excavations, which I won't talk a lot about, but it's important, I think, as a framework: Çukurriçi, Ulacak, and Bonjuklu. These tell us that that Neolithic farming communities have reached Western Anatolia by 6,700 BC calibrated. Probably slightly earlier, because whilst those dates relate to the earliest levels at Çukurriçi and Barcin, there are earlier levels, aceramic levels at Ulacak, that must predate 6,700 BC. I'll obviously talk about the central Anatolian evidence in a moment or two. But there's quite a timeline between the evidence we're now uncovering in central Anatolia and this western area, which has led to suggestions there might be some sort of farming, foraging frontier in this area. And I'll address that question as we consider the westward spread as well as the spread in central Anatolia. The other things, these are pictures of Ulacak in particular, just to illustrate what we're talking about. Mud brick buildings, rectangular buildings with red plaster floors, for example, at Ulacak, and rather scary sections that we won't comment on any further. This map neatly shows how a lot of people still conceptualise this process as relatively unidirectional and following particular routes, whereas I think some of the evidence we're finding suggests that we should think of much more diffuse processes, and not necessarily a simple sort of east-west pattern of movement, but also much more diffuse dendritic north-south interactions as well, which I hope to illustrate as we go. So really, I think that map is rather misleading, and we can explore that in thinking about the spread of farming between central Anatolia and the west, as well as the spread of farming in central Anatolia, that gives us a lot of instructive insight, I would argue, into what's really going on. So let's now turn to Bonjuklu itself, and Pınarbaşı a little bit as well, and think about some of the evidence we've got for the appearance of farming in central Anatolia on the Konya Plain. So first of all, the dating evidence. These are a set, not all, but some of the C14 dates from Bonjuklu. This is one trench at Bonjuklu down here. This is another trench at Pınarbaşı. These are Bayesian analyses. These are all short life samples, mostly well stratified human remains, occasionally some seeds and the like. And the Bayesian analysis is very useful because it ties down our main phase of occupation at Bonjuklu between about 8,300 and about 7,800 BC calibrated. Pınarbaşı has an occupation phase that's of a similar date, but also you will note has earlier dates as well. Early 9th millennium, about 8,700, 8,900 BC, and indeed from another trench at Pınarbaşı here, it's got a much earlier phase dating to the early Holocene, about 9,700, 9,800 BC calibrated, which is equivalent to the beginning of the PPNA in the Levant, for example. So the basic take-home story here is Pınarbaşı starts off earlier at the beginning of the Holocene, and earlier than Bonjuklu, and it lasts till at least 7,800 as well. There's a period of overlap between 8,300 and 7,800, 400 to 500 years between these two sites. So we can actually study potentially two communities in the Konya Plain at this crucial time period for the appearance of sedentism, agriculture and herding. I said two sites at Pınarbaşı and Bonjuklu. Obviously, two sites doesn't mean two communities. They could be seasonally occupied variants of the same community. But we've tackled this question by looking at the seasonality indicators from plant and animal indicators. The lower part of this diagram shows you Bonjuklu evidence for seasonality. These are the months, January to December. These are the seasons, winter, spring, summer, autumn. These black bars indicate the presence of seasonal indicators by these lines of evidence. And you can see actually it's pretty good evidence that both sites were occupied year-round, or most of the year anyway. Maybe there's a slight gap in the Pınarbaşı evidence in the early summer, but that might be deceptive. Certainly the strongest evidence of occupation at both sites in terms of seasonality is in the late summer and the winter and the spring So both sites were intensively occupied in those seasons. So it seems unlikely that they're seasonally specialised offshoots of the same community. They're probably two contemporary communities 30 kilometres apart in the latter part of the 9th millennium BC. What's the evidence then? The story is partly about the spread of farming. What's the evidence for the appearance of farming in the Konya Plain? This work's done by Andy Fairbairn at University of Queensland, by the way. So I'll start naming and shaming people as we progress. The picture's pretty clear. At Punabasha, even in the later phases from 8,500 to 7,800, there's no evidence of early cultivars or even the wild ancestors of the first cultivated plants. Okay? Zero, zilch. Probably they're not native to the area. They're probably introduced. Not surprisingly, crops like emmer and this new type, wheat as it's called as well, sometimes striate emeroid is how it's referred to. It sounds like a nasty disease, doesn't it? Striate emeroid, and it's a variant of wheat. Nothing at Punabasha. At Bonjuklu, domestic variants of these plants are found from 8,300 BC. So that's the earliest evidence of farming in central Anatolia, as early as some of the Shukra evidence. So it seems to appear in the Konya Plain sometime around, or maybe a little bit earlier than 8,300, given that we haven't dated or even estimated the earliest levels of Bonjuklu yet. But that's very interesting, because these two sites are contemporary, don't forget, Punabasha and Bonjuklu. Only 30 kilometres apart. One shows no evidence of crop cultivation, the other does. The community at Punabasha, a community of foragers, clearly appear to have rejected the adoption of crops of cultivars. Their contemporary community is a farming community only 30 kilometres away. So already I think you can start to see that the picture of the spread of farming in central Anatolia is probably quite a complex one, with a mosaic of communities doing different things. What sort of farming community are we talking about at Bonjuklu though? Interestingly, we would characterise these as low-level food producers. Probably a community to which, even though farming has been introduced, it's not important in terms of their subsistence practices. This compares both the ubiquity and frequency of the cereals at Bonjuklu, with slightly later Jansan 3 and slightly later again Chatabiak. And you can see that both in terms of ubiquity and frequency, the situation suggests crop production and use was not particularly significant at Bonjuklu. And the stable isotope evidence of human diets tends to support that to a degree as well. This is low-level food production in a marshy environment, don't forget, not surprising perhaps, and not a place you'd expect to find farming. Obviously, that picture derives from carbonised seeds, and there are taxonomic issues there that might suggest that it's difficult to completely rely on the frequency and ubiquity of these materials to get a sense of their importance in the diet. But luckily we have phytolith evidence as well. Phytoliths are much less destructible and much less subject to the same degree of taxonomic processes as the carbonised seeds. And they clearly point out, whilst we've got very, very dense phytoliths on the site, about 30 or 40% of our sediment is actually phytoliths, it's actually decayed plant materials. Phytoliths are silicified plant cells. Most of them are actually reeds, not surprisingly in the wetland environment, and only a very modest number of contexts have evidence of wheat phytoliths, for example. There's a set of contexts analysed. These are the only ones with wheat phytoliths in, and you can see they're not that common relative to the reed phytoliths, for example. So that supports the picture of low-level food production or farming. In addition, these phytoliths tell us other interesting information. These phytoliths are multi-celled, and wheat phytoliths are multi-celled phytoliths. They form long strings of phytoliths that show that they're growing in very wet conditions. That suggests that they're growing close to the site in this wetland setting I suggest the site is located in. That's very useful, so it does indicate that we are looking not just at people who are using farming products, because of course it's not possible these early forager communities could be importing crops from elsewhere. No, this suggests that they're growing them locally, and that's suggested also by the weeds of cultivation associated with them. So we've got low-level local crop cultivation at Bonjuklu with no evidence of Punabasha at all, and that's backed up by the Punabasha phytoliths as well. So there definitely isn't a taxonomic issue with Punabasha either, which is very useful. What about animal management? Here the picture is quite interesting as well, because yet again there is some contrast between Purnabacha and Bonjuklu. Both sites, probably the larger mammal fauna is dominated by Aurochs bos primigenius. You see 34% of this, 31% of this, but Purnabacha and Bonjuklu respectively. And probably given the size of these animals, the biggest contribution to the larger mammal element of the diet, although they are eating frogs and fish at both sites as well, you should understand, probably in significant quantities. Then, after that focus on the aurochs, there's a bit of a difference at Bonjuklu in the marshes. There's quite a lot of evidence of significant boar hunting, which is much less apparent at Purnabacha, even though it's next to a marsh and lake setting, which is quite interesting. Rather, Purnabacha has more caprines. Bonjuklu, interestingly, has a very low percentage of caprines, as you might see. We generally understand, especially from the Shukla and Chaklavir evidence, that caprines are probably the earliest domesticates on the Konya Plain and in central Anatolia. But one might imagine, given the low percentage at Bonjuklu, that they're not particularly interested in caprine management. In order to look at this problem, though, given the possibility for early management of morphologically non-domestic caprines, a PhD student at Liverpool University, Caroline Littleton, who's sitting in the audience, so you can ask her about this later on if you like, did a stable isotope study, carbon and nitrogen stable isotope study of caprine and boss diets from the sites of Purnabacha, Bonjuklu, Chaklavir. In particular, we're lucky at Purnabacha, we've got an epipaleolithic occupation as well, so she could look at the late Paleolithic caprines and the 10th and 9th millennium caprines from Purnabacha. They cluster down here in this part of the graph, low in nitrogen, no C4 plants in the diet. This contrasts with the morphologically domestic caprines from Chaklavir and Purnabacha up here, high nitrogen and quite a lot of C4 in the diet. The Bonjuklu caprines are really interesting here because they include some that have wild type diets, but some, these are two examples up here, about 50% of the modest sample, that have very elevated nitrogen, probably suggesting that they're having a non-typical diet, not a diet that would be expected of the caprines in the hills around the plain, but probably because they've been taken down onto the arid, saline, marshy plains as a result of human management. Even though caprines are only 2 or 3% of the animal list at Bonjuklu. So there probably is some caprine, again, very low-scale caprine management at Bonjuklu. Early stages of herding, local experimentation for caprine management. And that's supported by the fact that we've got through the soil micromorphology clear evidence of herbivore dung, sperolites from herbivore dung in the hearths and in the floors. They're using herbivore dung as fuel at Bonjuklu and as part of the floor planters as well. And indeed, given what a small contribution the caprines obviously made to the Bonjuklu diet, it's an interesting possibility that people are more interested in them for products like dung and maybe milk than for meat in a context like Bonjuklu. So when we put all this together, we've got a very interesting picture of diversity between about 8,300 and 7,800 in central Anatolia. When we add in especially the contemporary levels at the Shukla here, you can see that in terms of farming, in terms of animal herding, in terms of contribution to the diet, there's a site where the foragers seem to reject the adoption of farming and herding, a community where people are engaging with low-level food production, and at Shukla, probably a lot more emphasis on crop management and animal management. Caprine management seems quite clear at Shukla. And this is in a corridor only about 150 kilometres long across central Anatolia. Clearly, the adoption of farming in this setting is a very complex process. And when we think about the spread of farming westwards, I think we should bear this in mind. There's another lesson here as well. If you just looked at Purnabacha as an example of a 9th millennium site in central Anatolia, you would say, well, they haven't developed agriculture in central Anatolia at all, would you? So if you look at one site in any given area of western Anatolia, you're not necessarily going to get an understanding of what the full range of communities are engaged in that area. And we should bear that in mind when we've only got 3 sites excavated in the early part of the 7th millennium in western Anatolia. It probably isn't giving us anything like the real picture. So far I've focused on economic practices But one of the other interesting phenomena that we see in relation to these sites, only 30 kilometres apart in terms of Bonjuklu and Punabasha, is some very diverse social practices as well. I just illustrate that very briefly. We'll obviously explore that a bit more as we look at evidence for households at Bonjuklu, but I'll show you that briefly in relation to architectural features and pottery. So this is a Bonjuklu house, this is a Punabasha house. They're both oval, they're both set down into earlier deposits or natural, whichever it may be. But there the similarity ends. There's a very distinct floor layout on the Bonjuklu houses, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a minute or two. A very structured use of domestic space that we don't see in the Punabasha houses. And the Bonjuklu houses are built of mud brick. The Punabasha, there is no use of mud brick. The superstructures are wattle and daub. So the architecture and the nature of the households is rather different. There are many more plaster floors in the Bonjuklu houses than the Punabasha ones as well. So even though these are contemporary communities 30 kilometres away, many aspects of their household behaviour are different as well. And further, at Bonjuklu, for those of you that like your Neolithic to have pottery, at 8,300 BC, we have pottery at Bonjuklu as well, 1,000 years earlier than 1,300 years earlier than the earliest pottery in other parts of Southwest Asia, by and large. But there is no evidence of pottery at contemporary Punabasha at all. So a whole set of technological and social practices are very different at these two communities. It's not just economic practices either. And in terms of the spread of farming and its implications, as I said, going beyond the question of the mechanism to what it meant for the foragers caught up in this process, because in many senses low-level food producers are still foragers, and obviously the experiences of the process of the spread of farming are diverse and complex. But we might as well talk about mechanisms as well. How did farming turn up in central Anatolia? Is Bonjuklu a group of colonising farmers, for example? Well, the answer seems to be no. We know what the chipstone assemblages of the Konya Plain are like, obviously from the evidence of Punabasha from 10,000 BC and even earlier in the Epipaleolithic. They're a continuation of the local Epipaleolithic microlithic traditions. These microlithic assemblages continue at Punabasha, for example, to 7,800 BC, probably later to 7,500 BC. Even though there are many differences between Bonjuklu and Punabasha, the chipstone assemblages are virtually identical. They're these obsidian microliths. So basically you seem to be looking at indigenous forager communities, knowledgeable wetland exploiters in the Konya Plain who adopt farming, at least crops, from areas to the south and east. And that's suggested by the nature of some of the plants that appear. They are domestic, morphologically domestic plants. There's no in situ process of domestication. And they include things like emmer, which is clearly a Levantine wheat. So we do think here we've got clear evidence of adoption of cereals by indigenous forager communities in the Konya Plain. Obviously, some communities rejecting farming, like the Punabasha community, and some adopting, like the Bonjuklu community. By what mechanism then, to go beyond mechanisms, how are these crops arriving in the Konya Plain? That's the next obvious question that we have to ask. How are these indigenous foragers engaging with these new species and new methods of landscape exploitation? Well, this is again why I think any sense of farmer-forager frontiers have to be broken down, because it's very clear that central Anatolia has a long history before 8000 BC of interaction with other areas in Southwest Asia. For example, at Epipaleolithic Punabasha, as I said, has an Epipaleolithic phase dated to about 14,000 BC. We have clear evidence of ritual practices, for example, that show intimate interactions with the Levant. We have burials from which the crania have been removed, which you see in the contemporary Musuki as well. We have lots of evidence of marine shells at Epipaleolithic and early Holocene Punabasha, obviously travelling 220 kilometres minimum over the Taurus to get there. There's already Cappadocian obsidian, of course, in later Tufian sites in the Levant, continues into the 2DNA. There's lots of evidence of interactions. the shared symbolic repertoires on these gravestones, for example. And new technologies pop up in the Konya Plain. In the Epipaleolithic, you get these lunates, just like the obsidian, but just like the Levantine lunates, or core reduction strategies, or groundstone axes that all pop up, probably either inspired or through a direct contact with areas to the south and east, through contacts ongoing between 14,000 and 8,500 BC. So there may be farmers in Levant and foragers in central Anatolia to start with, but they're not isolated, they're not interacting, either as the Taurus Mountains in the way. There's intense interactions between central Anatolia and the Levant and areas to the east of central Anatolia for many thousands of years before the appearance of farming at 8,500, 8,400 BC. And it's probably through these interactions, which probably involve the movement of small numbers of people backwards and forwards, not in a unilinear direction, but backwards and forwards, that farming spreads. And that's why I think any sense that you've got an east-west sort of set of routeways, unidirectional routeways for the spread of farming out of central Anatolia westwards is probably completely misguided. The spread into central Anatolia isn't like that, so why should the spread westwards be like that? And that bother to go over the text, but that's said more or less what I said already. More recently, we've got some ancient DNA evidence to help flesh out this picture. Two projects working on the ancient DNA actually. This is complete genome work from a team at Metu in Ankara, and what we've got here are a little set of Bonjuklu individuals in these triangles, in this little oval, and here's our Bargin individuals immediately proximate to them. That immediately tells us there's very close genetic affinity between Bonjuklu community at 8,000 BC, let's say, give or take, and the Bargin community at 6,700 BC. One option, of course, is, so this is probably an Anatolian, central Anatolian type genetic population. One option, of course, is that members of this community, either perhaps before the occupation of Bonjuklu or after, spread westwards with farming up to northwestern Anatolia. Maybe it indicates that. But equally, it indicates another potential possibility, that there is a central and western Anatolian common gene pool that precedes the introduction of farming. That's equally possible from this evidence. We have to bear that in mind. But what it does suggest is that these communities are probably rather distinct genetically from those in Levant and southeastern Turkey. This is an Anatolian signature we're looking at here, an Anatolian plateau signature. And this evidence is becoming clear anyway, but now with the Bonjuklu evidence we can take it back earlier. It's, already the Bargin work showed the high similarity between the earliest southeastern Neolithic farmers, whose ancient DNA is shown in this part of the diagram here, and their similarity to Bargin. One of the intriguing things is they look even more similar to the Bonjuklu population. So it seems clear that this Anatolian genetic mix is responsible for a significant element of the genetics of the earliest Neolithic farmers in southeastern Europe. Whether perhaps Aegean foragers also shared some of this genetic mix would be interesting, because we don't know about the genetics of late Aegean foragers to be very sure about that, I would argue. So that remains an interesting possibility as well. The second bit of ancient DNA work is focusing on mitochondrial DNA, the team now at Durham, and this is unpublished results so far. This is showing some very interesting evidence. It supports the complete genome work, suggesting actually very distinctive Anatolian haplogroups, especially N1A and N1B, that are shared between Bonjuklu and the Bargin Menteşe community, and also the earliest Southeast European farmers, but suggests some significant differences between these Syrian PPMB communities to strongly indicate, again, an Anatolian genetic population group. Whether it came from central Anatolia and then spread to the west, or whether it was a common central West Anatolian group is difficult to say at the moment. And that's because we know so little about sites in this area before 7,000 BC. And just because we don't have the sites doesn't mean that people weren't there. Until we did our survey around Catalunya, we didn't have any people in the Konya Plain before 7,100 BC. And that's to do with the intensity of the survey methods, I would argue, and the nature of the surveys. There is, however, some emerging evidence, I think, of pre-7000 BC communities in central West Anatolia that strongly suggests that there are people before 7000 BC in Western Anatolia, whether farmers or foragers or both, and we don't really understand them very well. Some of the evidence has been staring us in the face for a long time. Obviously, a Hajalar in the lakes area, or somewhere between central and Western Anatolia, if you want to say. There's good indicators of an Aceramic community dating 8,000 to 7,500 by one date. But in particular, I want to point particular evidence that shows strong affinities with the Konya Plain evidence we're talking about. There's skull detachment and removal at Aceramic Hajalar. There are red painted floors, plaster floors at Aceramic Hajalar, just like you see in the Konya Plains. I'm going to show you shortly at Bonjuklu. What about this apparent absence of people? Why shouldn't we take it at face value? Well, let me give you another indication of the spread of farming as to why we shouldn't take it at face value. And this relates to the colonisation of Cyprus, probably from the southern Anatolian coastal areas. We have absolutely no evidence of 10th, 9th or 8th millennium occupation of this southern Anatolian strip opposite Cyprus. But almost certainly, between about 9,000 and 8,500 BC, farmers, took crops and animals to Cyprus from this area. Why from there and not the Levant? Well, as Daniel Bar Yosef's recent work clearly indicates, the currents and the winds would make it very, very difficult to settle Cyprus from the Levantine area. It's almost certainly got to be the Anatolian area. We've got no evidence of people here, but they're settling Cyprus by maritime methods. Boats with animals on, or rocks. Must have been fun. There are hints as well of South Anatolian populations at this period. This is the site of Okazini. There are dates from very poorly understood occupation layers from the 9th millennium of Okazini. We don't know what this means like. We don't have the plant remains or the animal remains of the site. We don't know what they're doing, but they're there. It's just people haven't really noticed this evidence because it isn't well preserved. And there's now other emerging evidence in the north as well, west of the Konya Plain. Here's a site that Metin Kartal discovered a couple of years ago in his survey of the coastal areas east of the Bargin site over here. This site, Kumuluk Tepe, for example, is an aceramic site with lots of obsidian, classic Neolithic technologies. Just a survey site, so we don't know whether people are farming or not. As I said, you shouldn't take one site at face value, but it must predate 7,000 BC and presumably relates to the slightly later communities in this area. Further south at Gurmelair, if I just nip back, Gurmelair's down here, west of the Antalya Caves, west of Okazini. We have a site with plaster floors, non-microlithic assemblages, a sickle blade, no caprines though, dated very clearly to 8,200 to 7,900 BC. We don't know whether this is a site of foragers or farmers, but those communities are there in western Anatolia long before 7,000 BC. And again, who knows what one site would tell us anyway, I would argue. Well, I don't know if anyone wants to plug in or anything like that. But that's a good indication, I think. But that's a good indication, I think, that these sort of simple arrows, unidirectional arrows of farming moving by a southern maritime route to the northern, central Anatolia to the northwestern route are probably very deceptive in terms of the nature of the spread of farming from central Anatolia westwards. So that's the first part of the lecture, as I said, where I thought I'd suggest some of the insights that the central Anatolian evidence indicates in terms of our understanding of the spread of farming. I think we've now got really good evidence for the way in which farming appears in central Anatolia at about 8,300 BC, and I think we've got tantalising evidence that we shouldn't see a rapid transfer of farming through a virtually unoccupied landscape after a period with a farming frontier around 7,000 BC. That seems extremely unlikely from the settings that I've production, and probably a very diffuse process as well. So now I want to move on to talk a little bit, a slightly different topic based on the Bonjuklu evidence, about the nature of these Neolithic households that we have at Bonjuklu. Talk about the farming. As I said, we're not just interested in mechanisms though, and overall processes, but what it meant for the foragers who were caught up in this process of the spread of farming. And I want to focus particularly on households because people have talked a lot about these at Chapelhill, for example. Ian probably now thinks of Chapelhill very much in terms of house-based societies there, for example. So to set the scene for this bit of the lecture, I just want to go back to some work by the economic anthropologist Marshall Salins, which I think has set the tone for a lot of discussion of Neolithic households. Salins, if you like, crystallised an understanding of what we might call the domestic mode of production model for small-scale cultivated communities that I think has been largely transferred in a rather unthinking way into the Neolithic of Southwest Asia and has even affected the way that people like Ian Hodler look at some of the evidence. Salins' argument was that these small-scale cultivated communities practicing a domestic mode of production strove for, typically in the anthropological record he suggested, showed evidence of striving for economic autonomy of the household or family, economic self-sufficiency, if you like. The household for such communities being the key organisational unit for production and consumption. Obviously, no household ever exists in isolation, in a communal corporate set of activities. But in the domestic mode of production, Salins argued, any communal supra household task would be all organised on a very flexible, ad hoc and transient basis. They wouldn't be part of institutionalised structures, he suggested. So that was his model based on the anthropological record, and people have imported it into the Neolithic of Southwest Asia. For example, Ted Banning and Brian Baird suggested that there's increasing economic autonomy through the course of the Neolithic relating to increasing grain exploitation and animal herding. And they suggest the evidence for this is to be found in Neolithic houses in the shift from curvilinear to rectangular, and in particular the increasing size and compartmentalisation of Neolithic houses. This is obviously a Chapelhill instance. So they suggest there's direct evidence for the Neolithic, the adoption of farming in particular, having a direct effect on the nature of households and a focus on household autonomy. In parallel with that, there's been a rather interesting set of reflections on the nature of corporate groups in the Neolithic, because the evidence for corporate groups is in many ways very apparent, and people haven't really reflected systematically on how this fits with a domestic mode of production model. The evidence, as I said, is right in your face. It's in large communal buildings, such as well known now from Göbekli, for example, or Jurfa Akhmar, that are clearly not domestic structures, but structures focused on communal or corporate supra-household interactions, if you like. In a way, people have obviously seen perhaps increasing household autonomy as rather at odds with the development of large, stable, cohesive communities. And the argument has been, I think, largely that the creation of supra-household communal institutions, as reflected in these large public buildings, is the counterpoint to the development of household economy. These are basically the councils, if you like, that held these communities together. So now to explore the Bonjuklu evidence in the light of that question of increasing household autonomy, looking at the nature of the Bonjuklu households and the extent to which we can see evidence for economic autonomy, and indeed the role of possible corporate groups at Bonjuklu. And in this, we'll obviously partly be looking at the antecedents of Chapelhill, as I mentioned already. I've already shown you a Bonjuklu house. We have about 22 of these buildings that show very repetitive features. They're oval structures. The lower parts are set into earlier deposits. They have mud brick walls, either from the base of the foundation or from above the foundation, and plastered floors and walls. All of these 22 buildings that we might characterise as houses are divided into two spaces, a larger southeastern clean area of floors and the northwestern third with a half in it that has what might be called dirty floors and might be characterised as the kitchen, food preparation area of the houses. This can be seen macroscopically in terms of the small artefacts and liquefied material found on the floors, but it also can be seen in our thin section work and shows that these distinctions are built into the houses from the beginning, because the floors used in these southeastern areas are typically of cleaner and thicker clays than those in the northwestern areas, and the northwestern floors are more frequently patched up. So these houses are designed with a structured differentiation for space use, and that is reinforced by repetitive daily practice in which the southeastern area is kept cleaner than the northwestern area, basically. It's interesting, this distinction as well, because it is the practices keeping these parts of the buildings distinct. They're obviously very repetitive and might almost be regarded as ritualised. They're so repetitive, mundane rituals, if you like, keep these areas distinct. But also the use of different materials suggests perhaps that there's some symbolic distinction to the different parts of the house that we're looking at as well. Well, of course, this is important for the socialisation of individuals. One of the advantages of this situation of very structured use of spaces, it meant when people who lived in one house or spent a lot of their time perhaps in one house went to another house, they knew exactly how to behave in that house because of the structured patterns of domestic activity were very similar from house to house. What sort of scale, we're talking about households, people often talk about households, but I'm actually talking about the scale of the household. How many people probably lived in these houses and used them regularly? Well, they're pretty small actually. You get a sense of this from our visualisation models. We've tried to put obviously scale models of people into these houses. And obviously the real constraining factor is how many people would sleep in these houses. And you get a sense that it isn't many, between 2 and 4 adults and probably some children tucked in around the side, especially if you have to allow some space for storage in these houses. Now obviously they're storing stuff because they're storing grain and sow for the next year's harvest. So there's a minimal amount of storage going on in these houses at least, and these little reconstructed baskets are allowing some space for that. So there's not a lot of space. There are no storage pits or storage bins built into the houses, so they have a low storage capacity. And that's already why one must doubt the model of economic autonomy for these houses. They don't have enough storage space for that. So we imagine households of 2 to 4 adults that could afford the co-presence in social activities of another equal-sized unit. So in terms of tasks going on in these houses, you can probably fit in about twice as many adults as could sleep in the houses. We've run lots of different models to show how the houses might have worked. This is quite important because it suggests that open spaces outside the houses are really important for social interaction, inter-household interaction in the community. The houses themselves don't afford the co-presence of lots of people. And this is a bit of a contrast with the Chapel Hill houses, the biggest ones of which could certainly afford the co-presence of lots more people. So you're starting to get a sense of the scale of the household that we're talking about there. There are other interesting phenomena to do with these houses, though, that relate to the symbolic use of space in the buildings. I've already suggested that there's probably some symbolic significance to the clean, dirty areas in these houses. And that's further reinforced in a pattern that, again, like the differentiation between clean and dirty areas, exactly prefigures the evidence from Chapel Hill. That is that the clean areas of these houses have underfloor burials that take place during the life of the house. People are buried under the floors while the house is still occupied. We know that because the plaster floors are plastered back over the graves after they've been dug and the house continues to be occupied. So burial rituals take place in the houses, in the clean areas. But there's also a series of other symbolic fixtures and fittings in the house. So we have animal heads and animal jaws, for example, buried in the walls of the houses. This is building 4, a couple of wild bull The crania are inserted into the wall, Foundation Act. Here's a reconstruction of what this double crania looked like, dates to about 8000 BC, plastered over. They interestingly chopped one side of one skull off from one of the other to fit them together. We don't know, this is a bit of a guess. Perhaps they were certainly plastered. What we can't be sure of is if it was plastered to look like a double-headed mythical bull, if you like, whether it was plastered to look like one large bull's head, in which case presumably the hunter or hunters that killed it would have said, look at the size of the bull and the hunter. Imagine the competitive aspects of that. So these symbolic paraphernalia are built into the walls and floors of the houses. Here at Bonjuklu, from the excavation this summer, there's the plaster face of the wall set into a little niche, exactly prefiguring the same treatment of the clean areas of Chapel. There are also painted clay and plaster reliefs on the walls. Here's the base of one, sadly truncated by a bulldozer. This went through 4 major phases of reconstruction. You can see them showing here, each of which was painted red 10 times. So there are 40 layers of red paint on this installation, showing that not only are we looking at symbolic paraphernalia, but a ritualised treatment, repetitive treatment of these symbolic paraphernalia as well. And this reinforces the fact that these clean areas of the houses are important arenas of ritual and symbolic practice as well. One of the interesting questions is just how intense and frequent this ritual practice was in the clean areas of these houses. And we're starting to get a handle on that, I think. Here's another set of radiocarbon dates, a Bayesian analysis, another set of radiocarbon dates that I haven't showed you yet from Bonjuklu. This is from a sequence of 6 buildings, short-life, well-stratified samples from 6 buildings in Area K at the site, one on top of the other. This clearly shows that this sequence of 6 buildings must have been occupied over a period of 60 to 80 years, basically. So we've looked at the number of floors in the houses in these buildings, and these are the number of floors in the main clean areas of the house. They're often small and frequent catchings of the floors in the dirty areas, and we nearly come to a sum total of 75 for this sequence of 6 buildings in Area K. So almost certainly we're looking at annual plastering of the floors of these buildings, give or take, maybe not absolutely every year, maybe occasionally more than once, but usually once a year. And that's obviously the pattern that the ethnographic record in the area suggests for the refurbishment of these buildings. So annual floor plasterings. And that allows us to look at the frequency, of course, with which, and the intervals between which, the paintings and the skulls and the burials are taking place. And they're showing us that typically floors are painted in these houses, on average about once every 10 years. There's the number of painted floors in this sequence of buildings. And here you see the intervals we calculate between paintings and burials. Anywhere between, let's say, 8 and 22 years, probably into these. So they're not necessarily the most frequent ritual activities or symbolic activities going on in these houses. And that's quite interesting, because it's often been argued that low intensity ritual practices low frequency ritual practices are often higher intensity and play a very important role in the bonding of groups together. This suggests that maybe these ritual practices were a key part of the memories shared by specific households and a key part of their distinctive identities. Because the other thing you should appreciate, just if I skip back here, is that none of these symbolic paraphernalia in any of these buildings are the same as in any other building. Each building has a unique disposition of bits of oryx head or horn core or boar jaw or whatever it might be. So these are probably unique indicators of household identities deployed in important ritual practices infrequently in the life of the houses. Then there's another interesting aspect to the symbolism in these houses, and that's something I started to mention already in the number of buildings that we find reconstructed one on top of the other. The buildings, even though there's, unlike at Chapel Hill, where there's not much open space in which you can leave your house, there's lots of open space at Bonjuklu. These buildings, nevertheless, are continually reconstructed in the same location. We've got 6 buildings in Area K. Here's just 4 of them that were reconstructed one on top of the other. The house is constantly rebuilt in the same location. And this is a deliberate device. Why are they doing this? I think for 2 reasons. Because they want to live over their ancestral dead. not just the ancestral dead that they buried during the life of the house they're living in, but the ancestral dead of preceding generations and preceding ancestral houses. And of course, not only are they living over the ancestral dead people, they're living over the ancestral dead houses as well. And I would suggest by doing that, they're emphasising the continuity of their household. This is a practice that transcends individual generations and can therefore be seen as the institutionalisation of the household and a symbolic statement of the continuity of that household, of the social and biological success of that household, continually rebuilt in the same location. And for small-scale households, that's quite important. Imagine biologically the possibility of a household not succeeding to reproduce itself over many generations when you have family or occupancy groups of just 2 to 4 adults. It's quite high that biologically and socially things won't work out for that household. So continuity is probably really important symbolically to the identity of these households as well. And it is direct continuity. We've got clear evidence. It's not just an accident houses reconstructed in the same location, but often the final closing acts in the life of a house are the foundation acts for the next house. So we have burials, a few burials, where the plaster floors don't cover the pits because they're the last stratigraphic act in that house. And indeed, in this case of a perinatal individual, the wall of the overlying house is constructed in the top. It goes into the top of the burial. So this dead child was an event that led to the closure of one house and a foundation burial for the next house. Hearths, too, are often used as a foundation for reconstruction of the hearth of the overlying house. Hearth continuity, as the hearth, if you like, of the house, is really important to the continuity of these households. And some of the Ukrainian and the like that I've talked about are foundation events as well, perhaps transferring the power of the aurochs and wild cattle, or maybe an ensuring of the power of the hunters that killed the aurochs in the continuity of the house. Finally, in terms of houses, I'd like to suggest there's a symbolic identification between perhaps people's bodies and houses too, so that people thought, hence in my title, Animal House, people thought of houses very like human individuals. We have lots of evidence that human bodies were painted. The dead have painted skulls, for example, on Bonjuklu. Their bodies are covered with ochre. The figurines show painting on the bodies of humans as well. So living human bodies and dead human bodies were painted. And of course, the bodies of the houses were painted as well. Culturally, people often divide their bodies into clean and dirty areas. Many communities show that sort of practice. And that's what we've got in the Bonjuklu houses as well. And the strong evidence that the death of a house and the birth of a house was a rite of passage for a house, just like birth and death were rites of passage for people as well. And that's indicated in other indications of rituals attached to the foundation of houses. I mentioned Ukraine, but also the dismantling of houses. So the head of the house was removed, just like we've got head skulls removed from people. The bones, the limbs of the house, if you like, were removed as well. The posts were removed from their post holes at the end of the life of the house. And the fact that was a ritualised practice is strongly suggested by the fact that objects are typically deposited in these post holes. Here a bear figurine and an obsidian core. Here a bone point and an obsidian point. Here a groundstone tool, which is another bone point from one of the post holes. So the closure of the house was involved a set of ritual acts for that rite of passage associated with the burial of the house. And that's why I suggest that actually people didn't want to just live over their ancestral dead humans, but they wanted to live over the ancestral dead houses as well. So here I've shown you perhaps strong evidence for the house as an important institution. But does that amount to the economic autonomy of the household? I think this is the confusion that people have made. They've conflated a strong symbolic identity of house and household that we see in the Neolithic with economic autonomy. I don't think there's evidence of that in Bonjuklu in terms of storage. But if I may just have 5 minutes more, I don't want to run on too long. Is that okay? We'll talk a little bit about burials. Because we said, obviously, that there are, oops, sorry, I'm going the wrong way there. There are burials under the floors of the houses, but there aren't enough dead under the floors of the houses. In the area of Petty Sequence, for example, there's only 2 burials in that 75, let's call it 75, plus or minus 5 or 10 years. Only 2 burials, one of them a perinatal child, I've shown you already. The Sequence building 6 to 10 has 0 burials in it. Occasionally, houses have enough burials, building 14, but mostly they don't. There's an insufficiency of dead under the houses. Where are the missing dead? Well, we started to find them over the past couple of years at Bonjuklu. The missing dead are in the open spaces in the middle of the settlement between the houses, in the public areas. Some of them are just like the burials under the houses. They're complete articulated inhumations with their heads and similar sort of graveyards. There are a couple of differences, though, in this burial area. One is that there seem to be special caches of large artefacts buried in pits around the burials. It's interesting, these very distinctive artefacts, this is, I think, the biggest flint blade known in the Neolithic, for example. Don't forget, this is a community that largely uses microlithic tools this size, so that flint blade is quite something, I can tell you. These are really big items by the standard of our very heavily used, heavily curated stone tools on the site. So these are special deposits, caches, as you can see, around the burials. But they're not deposited with any individual, they're deposited in groups near the burials. So these are more likely to be corporate or communal group acts related to the burial of dead, the missing dead in the open spaces. The other fact that we're looking at a more communal or corporate world in these burials is suggested by the evidence we've got for disarticulation. Some of the burials in the open spaces consist of pits with disarticulated individuals. Here we have a pit that has lots of long bones from 6 individuals. Here a stack of 3 skulls, for example. And here we've got an instance of a painted skull, a detached painted skull that's placed over ochre-covered bones, possibly from a different individual, but certainly it's part of the disarticulation process. So we've got disarticulated people. People are divided up at death, and their divided remains are interred in special places. Indeed, there's some evidence that some of these bones have a long period of circulation, because in addition, in these open spaces, we've got evidence for the deposition of human skulls. Skulls are removed and circulated. Many of them are very warm before they're deposited in pits in these open spaces. It's possible, of course, that some of these disarticulated remains, or some of these people buried in open areas, could be from other communities. Headhunting, for example. We consider that possibility, but strontium analysis, strontium isotope analysis, indicates strontium isotopes identical with the people buried under the houses and apparently conforming to a fairly local signature around Bonjuklu. So these are not likely to be heads from people at Fenerbahce, for example. They don't have their heads, as it happens in the burials there. So it's interesting, these are probably pretty local individuals to Bonjuklu, as local as the people buried under the floors. But we do have some other isotope information that's very telling about these, especially the skulls, the disarticulated individuals buried in the open areas. If you look at the carbon and nitrogen isotopes of these individuals, it suggests that they have a rather distinct diet. So these squares are humans who are buried under the house floors. These triangles are humans whose skulls end up deposited in the midden area in the open space. It seems clear that the individuals whose skulls end up in the open space, even though they have the same strontium isotopes as our friends over here, they're eating a fishier diet, and a diet with more birds in it, for example, possibly more vegetable foods as well. Whereas our individuals over here are likely to be eating foods from this bit of the graph that are the aurochs and the wild boar in particular. Now, when we're talking about diets here, we're talking about collagen from which the isotopes have come. And that's deposited over the last 10 years probably before the death of the individual. So we're not talking about a few meals at the end of the life of these individuals. We're talking about a consistent long-term pattern of diet differentiation. of people who are eating the same food together, and they're being buried, their bodies are being treated in a different way, and their bodies are being disposed of in the open spaces. And I'd like to suggest that these are people who are probably belonging to some form of such a household, communal or corporate group that is as institutionalized as the households that we've seen, but whose members must come from some of those houses. They're the missing debt from the houses, after all. So there are institutions, corporate institutions, that cross-cut the houses and households I'm talking about. They probably have a strong economic as well as ritual role, given the differentiation in food consumption we're talking about here. It's interesting that this differentiation relates to, for example, the consumption of fish and wetland birds. Most of the birds are ducks and geese, for example, that are being consumed at Bonjuklu. So it's quite likely that these communal and corporate groups partly exist relating to differential exploitation of the landscape around the site. So whilst houses and households seem to have a strong identity, it seems symbolically important to stress the identity of these households. Nevertheless, I would argue that corporate groups and communal groups must have operated in an equally important way at Bonjuklu. It's just that they're less visible to us because they don't have the sort of architectural evidence that they do at some other sites. At Göbekli, at Shukla, at sites like Jurkalakmar, we can be pretty confident we've got corporate groups because we have their buildings. At other sites where we don't have their buildings, like Chapel Hill as well, so you go to Chapel Hill, corporate groups may have acted in different ways and expressed themselves in different ways. In the open spaces where these groups may well have met and interacted, as well as out in the landscape, were probably important in the identity of those corporate groups, just as the houses were important to the symbolic continuity of the households. So I think there's some very interesting evidence here that challenges, let's say, this sort of model of economic autonomy in households, that stresses the symbolic significance of institutions in Neolithic society. And I'll stop there. So, thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Douglas, for giving us an overview of some of the most recent information that's coming out and stressing the diversity, really, if you like, of initial agriculture from before that, and then bringing us through to some detailed sort of observations from excavations of Bonjuklu, which were telling us interesting things about households and corporate identities as well. I'm sure with those topics, I'd be astonished if there aren't the odd question in the audience, so I'll throw it open to Mr. Pickle. Yes, John.
I mean, first of all, thank you very much. You talked about the antecedents of Chapel Hill, and I was wondering, how you see the interaction between Bonjuklu and Ulabashi in, say, some of the more social, symbolic aspects. Do you see sort of you talk about sort of differences in house plans, but do you see some sort of connection or interaction?
Well, obviously there's certain things that are shared. I mean, their love of oryx, meat seems to be shared. The chipstone tool repertoires are very similar. But the houses are very different. So at Ulabashi we have no evidence of subfloor burial under the houses. We don't have evidence for the constant reconstruction of the house in the same location either. We don't have any evidence for Ukrainian or bull's jaws in walls or that sort of thing. So if you like, the symbolic dimension of house continuity and ancestry that seems to be stressed by the houses of Bonjuklu, or the households of Bonjuklu, is not apparent at Ulabashi. So that's, which I started to, I wanted to introduce that quickly, you couldn't explore more, but that is what I was saying perhaps in that earlier slide, contrasting the houses. And it extends to other things as well, so that there's pottery at Bonjuklu and there isn't pottery at Ulabashi. There also have lots of clay objects at Bonjuklu, little clay spheres and cones and discs. There are none of those at Ulabashi. So people are doing things quite differently at Bonjuklu from Punabasha.
But in the sense that they have like a different economic strategy, in particular there's some sort of economic connection that then in ways they could complement each other and this diversity.
So one of the obvious possibilities, one of the things that you might see on here is, well, obviously Bonjuklu, even if it's low-level food production, is a community of farmers, and maybe even though it's low-level, and this is one of the, we certainly think this has a role, probably the adoption of cereal and legume cultivation had considerable significance for the community of Bonjuklu. But it may not, its significance probably was not in a economically dietary sense, but again was potentially more in the symbolic realm and what it meant for changes in terms of your relationship to landscape or bits of the landscape, for example. And how you might deploy. If you haven't got a lot of, if you're not consuming lots of cereals, then what is their significance within your community? Maybe they're actually being used in very particular ways for important seasonal meals or that sort of thing. So quite possibly, the diversification, in a sense, what you're looking at with the introduction of cereal and possibly caprine management is a diversification of tasks and landscape engagements, and that is important for the community and the households involved, and may have changed the dynamic between the households. Certainly, if we imagine that these different corporate groups operating in relation to different tasks in the landscape, it suggests an important social role for the different sorts of things you do in the landscape, between different households and different community groups, and that would have been part of a contrast with Punabasha. But I think a lot of it's about, you've got to say, so the obvious question, I think, here, if I may ask myself a question that I didn't address, is why does the Punabasha community not adopt, but the Bonjuklu community adopts cultivation and maybe animal management. Why doesn't the Punabasha community adopt a bit of cultivation and animal management maybe? That's an interesting question we have to ask as well, I think. And I think it's partly a question of identity, and that may apply to lots of these other things. For the Punabasha community, the business that farming was involved might have meant too much of a change in its identity, and it was important potentially to maintain, for whatever reason, a contrast in the identity of the community of Punabasha with the identity of the community at Bonjuklu. So it's a symbolic statement of identity differentiation as well, if you like. Especially when it was maintained over 400 or 500 years after all. I mean, they're only 30 kilometres away. Of course they must have interacted. They got obsidian from the same sources. Obsidian probably passed through each of these communities to the other community. Potentially they exchanged partners, but nevertheless, in certain important ways, how they built they don't ever anywhere use mud brick at Punabasha. I think that's, for 400 years, they're using it at Bonjuklu to build their houses. There's not even a tiny fragment of mud brick at Punabasha. So it's not just about the farming, it's about a whole bunch of things. No clay object ever made it from Bonjuklu to Punabasha. They're that size. They're not exactly difficult to carry around. They're not heavy. Now that is fascinating as well. And yet, 50% of the groundstone tools used at Bonjuklu, you've seen some of them, came from a source 5 kilometres away from Punabasha, and that's where most of the Punabasha groundstone tools were. So they knew of each other very well. They were travelling past each other, but they maintained these very distinct landscape engagement strategies and household practices and other stuff too. Whatever they do with pottery at Bonjuklu, what they do with the very small amount of pottery they've got at Bonjuklu is an interesting question, but whatever they do with it, they're not doing at Punabasha.
Thank you very much for a really, really fascinating lecture and sort of updating my knowledge, at least, on the region and introducing themes and critiques actually that resonate with me certainly. And I just wanted to, many questions, and hopefully I'll get a chance to talk to afterwards. But one thing I just wanted to ask you about the latter half of your lecture, And this critique that you're developing, you were proposing at beginning with signs, and I totally agree with what you're saying, how you're setting that up. But I wonder, wasn't there a little bit of a danger of falling into the trap of identifying structures and then projecting this household concept onto them and inviting us to think of these individual structures as households when it's perfectly possible and certainly ethnographically parallel that the social group that people identify with might be using multiple structures for maybe different tasks or different elements of an extended unit. So there's a danger a little bit of I mean, we've certainly fallen into this trap, and I certainly made this potential error myself in thinking about the Neolithic, in that we just project the household onto whichever architecture street.
Yeah, absolutely. And in some ways, the final bit of my talk sort of says, well, we've got to be careful about that, because obviously we do have these, inter-household, supra-household, whatever you want to call them, entities operating very clearly. But I think in most of the situations where you tend to have what you might call a household using multiple structures, they tend to be a bit differentiated in some way. So you might have a kitchen building or that sort of thing, and maybe a sleeping building, or a building for the males and one for the females, or whatever it might be. Whereas that obviously perhaps didn't make quite enough of it, but all of these buildings are, in terms of their basic domestic fixtures and fittings, obviously the symbolic repertoire is different, but in terms of the domestic settings, they're extremely standard. They have a hearth in the northwestern area, they don't have storage bins, they don't have storage pits or anything like that, so they replicate each other. And in that situation, it seems like there's some sense of, I mean, I'm certainly not suggesting families or the nature of the kin relationships here, but that there is a sort of replicable unit that kind of forms more or less. And if you think, again, it depends, I mean, there wasn't time to go into this, it partly depends on whether you think that people, there's a sort of assumption there that wasn't explicit, again, time issues, but, if one thinks that the people buried under a house floor are the people that were closely associated with that house, at least for quite a lot of, a significant time period, then obviously, we tend to have situations where we do have a range of burials there, males and females and children, which was a little bit like a family unit, presumably, that, used that structure a lot. And it doesn't mean that people didn't move backwards and forwards between structures, presumably when marriage partners were exchanged and so on, they did, for other reasons too. But it does suggest a certain continuity in a male, female, child complex within each house. And there's a little bit of evidence, and again, that fits with building the house again and again in the same location, that continuity. And there's a little bit of genetic evidence to support that, so that in columns of houses we seem to have, there are people with the same mitochondrial DNA in the stacks of houses. Sadly, the whole genome stuff, they can't quite, there's a couple of people buried in one stack of houses that have an extremely similar genetic signature, but they still can't narrow it down to a 2 or 1 degree of relationship familiarity, because you need really big samples to do that. But the bits of evidence we have tend to suggest that we're looking at something a bit more like household in some sense equals house, but we shouldn't think of them as completely discrete. I'm sure people did, move backwards and forwards between these things we're calling houses.
Thank you very much for the very interesting lecture. I've got 2 interrelated questions that may strengthen your argument against the increasing household autonomy, which, as you may know, I've always supported in my work. I am against the increase of the idea, the model of the increasing of household autonomy. So, question A is, do you have any other evidence of the use of external areas apart from the collective burials? And B, question B is, you said that you've recovered 22 buildings at Bonjuklu.
I said 22 houses. So
yes.
a couple of other buildings.
Even better. Did you have any picture of the arrangement, spatial arrangement? I mean, settlement organization.
Yes.
Because these are round structures.
Oval, yes. Yeah. Also.
Could they perhaps have been arranged around, I mean, in a circle or
Sort
something?
of.
Or
Okay,
around
let's
central
start with
area,
question A.
Open area? Yes.
And then we'll go on to question B. So question A, just remind me, was what was your question?
If there's any other evidence for the use of external layers.
Yeah, so there's
apart
lots of
from
other
layers.
evidence. There just wasn't time to go into
What
it.
do they do outside,
So
outdoors?
what they do outside is they do a whole range of things. So especially in the most extensive bit of area we've excavated, there are lots of hearths. So there's lots of fire-related activity, and as far as we can see, it's probably a lot of that is to do with food preparation. So people are certainly, probably in inter-household groups, they are, preparing food and sharing. But obviously, that's what the isotopes suggest in some cases. So that's presumed. The burials are close to some of those hearths actually. So there's a lot of that activity. They're firing pottery. Some of the pottery out there is probably fired in those areas. And also there's a lot of evidence of carcass dismemberment and disposal and food preparation. The microware and the lithics from these areas also suggest a lot of plant working activity, a lot of reed working and that sort of thing, and that would fit with the photographs evidence we have out there as well. And so a range of craft and food preparation, food consumption activities. But interestingly, there's quite a lot of evidence of structured use of that space. So we often find that hearths are continually, even in these open areas where there are no buildings as such, surrounding them, that we can see any evidence of anyway. There might have been like roof structures in some places, I think. Hearths are continually made in the same place, in the open areas. In addition, there are areas of sort of clay surface that look like external surfaces, and they're continually laid in the same place and have little pits dug into them. And then the other thing that goes on in these open areas is cracking, human fecal disposal and animal probably fecal disposal. There are toilet areas, basically, in structured parts of these open spaces, and that are continually used as toilet areas, basically, which is very interesting, by almost certainly humans and some carnivore, presumably dogs. We have puppy burials on the side, so presumably dogs. But we can't be absolutely sure about it. We haven't had the bile acid and proper analysis of that stuff. So it's a very structured use of open space for a whole set of activities, basically. And there's a little bit of small-scale storage in these open communal areas as well, which is interesting, suggesting that some of the storage is communal. So lots of evidence, but quite diverse and really important activities. Of course, the other thing that's happening out there is that keeping the house floors quite clean and they're dumping the waste outside as well in certain areas, min disposal activities. So they're the main categories. In terms of this organisation settlement, for a while we did think that maybe the central area was a sort of big open space and that there was a set of structures around, maybe a bit like Kermest area or Hallam Cheney, these sites in the southeastern area. But I think as we've gone on, we've seen that structures sort of in different phases, they're rebuilt in the same location for quite a long time periods, but in different phases they will crop up in the central space, for example, on the site. So I don't think there's any, whilst there might be a tendency for houses to be more in the sort of, I won't say the very outer zone of the site, but let's say a sort of inner circle of the site. It isn't a sort of strict situation, and houses are clearly, house sites where these sequences are reconstructed in the same location do move backwards and forwards over the long term, 1,000-year history of these sites.
They grouped in clusters, perhaps, three houses there,
then
four houses
again, I
there.
think we've done quite enough to be sure about that, but we do have situations where you seem to have like a set of two houses together, so they're sort of like two parallel sequences side by side, so maybe small, interrelated, quite closely related households, presumably operating side by side, closely related. Again, if a principle is not to move too far away from your ancestral dead, then you can see how that might happen. There might be little clusters. But at the moment, I think we can just say we have situations where we seem to have sets of two houses side by side over quite a long time period, reconstructed again and again and again, side by side. But not overall clustering, nothing like Chapel here. Mostly these little sets of two are quite spread out from each other.
Thank you.
I think probably we should move to a less formal context and let Doug off the hook for a moment. But please join us next door for a glass of wine, some of the weeds, and an opportunity to continue the discussion less formally. But thank him very much again for his rich and stimulating talk.
Thank you.